Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hey, it's Zoe Routh here, and we have a very important conversation for you today. My guest today is Nina Simons. She's the co-founder and chief relationship officer at Bioneers. She is the author of Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. And our conversation talks about how do we go about creating systemic change in a very interconnected system, a system that includes nature, politics, environment, economics, you name it, all of the human and natural systems combined. So it is a big picture conversation. And I guess, well, you'll have to see what the excitement is and the intervention is that we can all take, each of us individually, to start a systemic positive change to creating a better, more proactive, more productive, more equitable society, community, environment. Well, that's an introduction. It's quite an introduction, and it's quite a conversation. Let's go on with the show. Alrighty then, all the way from Santa Fe, or just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, we have on the show, and welcome to the show, Nina Simons.
Well, thank you, Zoe. It's great to be here with you.
I am really intrigued by our upcoming conversation. The title of your book, your latest book, the latest edition of your book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. And in our brief conversation, it was about women and men and how we can balance our institutions and our approach to leadership, which is fabulous. I'm really excited to dive into that. Now, before we go into the nitty-gritty of that, though, how the heck did you get to be doing what you're doing? How have you evolved as a human to where you are right now?
Well, it's a long and windy road, but I'll try to make it brief. I first fell in love with theater as a way to transform people's self-awareness and culture. And then I realized how hard it might be to make a living at that kind of theater, since a lot of people really go to theater principally for entertainment, not to have their belief systems dislodged.
Oh my God, that's right. Because having your beliefs dislodged is not a comfortable experience at all. So why would you go out for a night out to go and have my beliefs challenged?
So I got a little disillusioned, and I worked in the arts because I was the daughter of two artists, and I helped promote all kinds of arts events, and studied with a mystical school called Eureka that taught me all kinds of tools for observing myself and relating to myself and others. And then when I moved to New Mexico from New York City, I met eventually my husband-to-be, and we started working together almost immediately. And at the time, he was a filmmaker, actually making a documentary about the politics of medicine, and specifically about how there were alternative cancer therapies in the world that had pretty well been systematically run out of the US, and that patients who were diagnosed with cancer didn't have access to the full range of possibilities open to them. And I didn't know anything about medicine or cancer therapies, but because I was spending so much time with him and I was picking up the phone and talking to people who'd just been diagnosed all over the world, I became engrossed in that cause. And I wound up helping him finish the film and then marketing and distributing it all over the place. And it was called Hoxie, How Healing Becomes a Crime. And he's since done a book following on it. And then as a filmmaker, he was invited to film a biodiversity garden. And again, as a city girl and an arts girl, I didn't know anything about gardening or farming, but I went along, I thought, for a weekend in the country. And I had this amazing experience, Zoe, of being introduced to this garden in a way that I had never experienced the plant world before. And it was being grown by a master gardener named Gabriel Howarth. And he introduced me to each plant as we went through the garden, using its common name and its Latin name, and then explaining how it was related to all the plants around it. And then he invited us to taste as we walked through the garden. And I have to say, it was the most beautiful garden I had ever seen. It was filled with hundreds of varieties of food plants and flowers and herbs and vegetables, many of which I'd never seen before. This was in the late 1980s. And there were gorgeous, this riot of colors and smells and tastes and pollinators. And as I walked through the garden, I started tasting things. And, you know, it was the best tasting tomatoes I'd ever tasted. And of course, they were warmed in the New Mexico sun. And it was just a fabulous sensory delight. And then as we walked through the garden, he explained why he was growing all this diversity of food plants, because there was a threat to the human food supply as more and more multinational corporations were gobbling up small mom and pop seed companies that had been breeding and cultivating these very diverse, often heirloom and traditional plants for decades and sometimes centuries. And so there was a loss to biodiversity that actually threatened our collective food supply. And by the time I walked out of that garden, I felt like the spirit of the natural world tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're working for me now." And I had no background in science, none in gardening or farming. And I quit my job with an arts organization and went to work for what became a social entrepreneurial company called Seeds of Change. And soon after that, we were both learning about biodiversity hand over fist. And also I was doing all of this marketing and outreach to journalists, and it was before the internet. So it was a labor of love. And I felt like I was working on behalf of the future of life on Earth. I just felt really engaged and passionate about what I was doing. And then Kenny was learning about all these people who had amazing solutions to many of our most pressing environmental and social challenges. And he was telling a friend about it in a hot tub one day. And the friend said, "Wow, they sound amazing."
Because that's where intellectuals are, in hot tubs.
Sharing important ideas, of course. And and the friend said, "Why don't you have a conference?" And Kenny said, "Well, I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that?" And the friend said, "Here's a grant. Start a conference." And Kenny came to me because of my background in theater. And I had never been to a conference either. And he said, "Will you help me start a conference?" And so I sort of grudgingly said yes. And then I remember sitting there at the first conference we ever hosted of Bioneers, which was in 1990. And I just remember, Zoe, sitting there with my mouth hanging open and thinking, these are the communicators and the leaders whose work I want to support in all the ways that I possibly can. And that's really how Bioneers got started. We actually led it in our spare time on top of our day jobs for 8 years before getting a really substantial grant to grow it into an organization. And we have been co-evolving it ever since for a total of 32 years now.
Wow. And what is the specific objective of Bioneers?
Well, we started Bioneers principally in response to James Hansen really sounding the alarm about climate change way back in '89. And we knew that the scientists all agreed. We knew that it was happening. We could observe it happening. And we also knew that there was an immense amount of money going into teaching people and laying the groundwork for climate denial. And so part of our purpose was to awaken people about climate change, but part of it was really to share a systemic, whole system worldview that said you can't really look at our ecological challenges without integrating an awareness of our social inequities. And you can't really look at education or medicine or spirituality or anything else without looking at the whole picture, because it's all connected to everything else. And in many ways, one of the greatest systems errors that we as humans have made is to imagine that we are apart from rather than a part of the natural world, which of course is really our mother and our home, and to whom we owe everything.
I think I think lots of responses to your comments there, and appreciation of Mother Nature has been a fundamental aspect of different Indigenous cultures for a long time. And yet your comments about how it's integrated into the social, economic, political system as well, and that how that's all interconnected, is actually a fairly advanced leadership maturity concept that not everybody's equipped well enough to embrace and handle and navigate. So I find it curious as to how you want to encourage individuals and societies to move to that whole of system thinking. And I think it's interesting how your desire to change people's beliefs originated way back when you were in theater. It's like you've always wanted to push the edge of people's understanding and beliefs. And that is hard work. To get people to challenge how they think of themselves and the world around them is confronting work. And it's not an easy journey to go through that. And you kind of need to have people to go willingly through that. So that was a preamble to the question, which is, right, if we need to look at whole of system to understand climate change, agriculture, medicine, and inequality in society, where do we start? How do you start thinking in that way? And what can we do as a result of that?
Well, and I think, Zoe, as I had this opportunity to study leadership through many years of hosting extraordinary leaders from all walks of life, and really learning from them, whether they were sometimes consciously mentoring me or not. And there was a big turning point for me when I began being recognized for my own leadership. And I mean, I think you're exactly right that at a very young age, I saw that culture was part of the problem, and that if we didn't change people's belief systems and their culturally entrained norms, we were going to be in danger. And ultimately, honestly, I believe at this point that the future of our species is currently endangered because of the combination of climate change and pollution and all the things we know, which have just reached very close to a tipping point. So we have to change our behavior. And for me, when I began being acknowledged as a leader, although I knew that I should be flattered, what I found in myself was that I really wanted to deflect it. I didn't like being labeled as such, and I didn't know why. And I had learned from pioneers that actually, because of the gravity of all of the challenges we currently face on Earth, that we're all called upon to be leaders now. So I really began about a 25-year inquiry into the nature of leadership. How is leadership changing? And is the emergence of more and more women into leadership in every sector and sphere of life giving us some models for how leadership is changing? And there are men, of course, who are modeling new forms of leadership as well. So for me, there is this intertwining about how we see gender and how we see leadership. And what I became aware of in myself was that I had inherited all these preconceived notions of what leadership looked like. And I saw it as dominating. I saw it as fundamentally hierarchical. I saw it as winner takes all proposition. And my mental model of leaders was often people who moved into leadership because they had inherited money or an inherited role, or they had achieved graduate degrees and therefore been dubbed leaders, or they had job titles that conferred authority upon them. But what I saw within the Bioneers world was people who moved towards leadership because they were really passionately moved to protect or defend or transform something that they really cared about, something they loved in the world. And, we all have things we love in this world, and I don't know that there is a stronger motivator than that. But what I found was that the leaders that I most admired were the ones who were internally motivated, who tended to collaborate and share leadership, who were not afraid to be vulnerable or not know an answer or ask for help, and who tended to lift others up and to deploy what I call their relational intelligence in figuring out a strategy or how to move forward, that really integrates a whole person perspective in their thinking, in their assessment, and in their leadership of their teams. So for me, the old model has been patriarchally influenced by hundreds or thousands of years of patriarchal culture that I think has been true around the globe, and particularly in governance and business and finance. And that we are witnessing right now an opportunity for the rebalancing, not only of how many women are in leadership, but of how the masculine and feminine principles can come more into balance. Because really, I think we have all inherited societies and cultures that automatically incline toward the masculine and often unconsciously devalue those human aspects we consider to be in the, quote, feminine. And really, I believe as humans, we all have masculine and feminine within us, and we need to reclaim that balance to be the best leaders we can be to meet this time. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So if I was to summarize the response, it is that the starting point for embracing whole of systems thinking is to start with more holistic leadership, which in your language is a balancing of masculine and feminine. I personally find it challenging to think in those terms, those binary gendered terms. And maybe it's because I want to dismiss that as an issue. And maybe that's a sign of my own bias that I want to get beyond gender conversations and to talk about more human conversations. So I'm curious about that. Do we need to talk in male, female approaches to leadership? Can we talk about it in a different way? Like the way that you were talking about it in terms of the relational aspects of leadership is a non-gendered conversation. So tell me a little bit about that. So is it helpful to be talking about male, female, especially with all the conversations about multiple aspects of gendered experiences, not just the binaries? Or is there a different kind of conversation that could be had?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, I am advocating for a different kind of conversation. And, there's a wonderful primate scientist who's Dutch named Frans de Waal, and he recently published a book called Difference. And what he suggests is that the whole conversation globally has focused on gender when it really needs to be focused on equity. Because in the primate world, our closest biological relatives, if a mother of an infant dies, often a male ape will adopt the infant and parent it. So we all have masculine and feminine, quotes, within us. We all have yin and yang. It's the most ancient principle in many of the world's spiritual traditions. And so the notion is really we have inherited biases that we have never consciously chosen or adopted. For some of us, those biases may not have to do with gender. They may have to do with being introverted or extroverted. They may have to do with how we process information. They may have to do with race and ethnicity and class. All of those issues are coming to the fore right now. And so I think what excites me is to look inwardly. I mean, one of the things, Zoe, that I think is important to think about in this regard archetypally is that Carl Jung suggested that the masculine is related to the things we can see and touch and feel in the outer world, and the feminine is related to our inner worlds, to our emotions, to our intuitions, and to our love. And, what I'm saying is, in order to survive all of the challenges that we are facing, and we won't all survive them, but to make our best way through it, I believe we need to integrate all of our human qualities. And as leaders, it becomes ever more important to unearth our own internal biases so that we can relate to people in ways that can truly respect and honor their gifts, even though they may be quite different than our own.
So how do we go about doing that? I think that's a really important question, unconscious bias. How do you make it conscious? Where do we start?
Well, this morning I decided that I should go back and look at all the reviews that I've received from my recent book, which really describes how to do that.
Why would you do that? It's so painful.
Oh, it wasn't, though. It was very joyous, actually.
Oh, good.
It was really lovely. And what I found kind of amazed me. I found the most wonderful quote from somebody I've never heard of, who said, if someone had told me that I had biases, feared to be heard, and preconceived prejudices, I would have fought that statement to the death. By reading this book, I have uncovered layers of things I didn't know I held. So I think, part of my premise has been that it seems that I'm able, by sharing my own inner experience, to encourage others to do the same and to offer a roadmap, if you will, and practices and discussion guides. And it is an arduous piece of work, but frankly, I've never encountered anything in my life that I feel more proud of. And what it's led me to is experiences of being able to really connect with people whose backgrounds and life experience are so different than my own that it gives me a sense of what Martin Luther King Jr. may have meant when he coined the phrase beloved community. And if we can have those kinds of relationships in our work environments and with our teammates, I believe we can exponentially increase our productivity, our longevity, and the quality of life we all share in our workplaces.
I understand the benefits to it. And so this arduous self-assessment or self-discovery roadmap, how do we start doing that? How do we put up the mirror and go, how is my thinking biased? How are my beliefs biased?
Well, I can offer a few examples and say, for some people, they may choose to have this be an individual practice, whereas for others, it may be made easier or accelerated by having a partner or a circle that you do this with. One of the earliest examples I can remember was that I realized that when I got out of my shower in the morning and looked at myself in the mirror, I had this critical inner voice that would immediately say, oh, your hips are too big and your butt is too this, and, all these criticisms of my physical body. And one day I sort of realized, I am doing ongoing violence to myself when I do that. And perhaps it's a product of this deficit image conscious culture that has informed my life, and perhaps I can change it. And so what I did, Zoe, was I actually made up a ritual. And I got some skin moisturizer or body oil that I liked, and I found some essential oils that I liked the scent of to mix in with it. And in those same 2 or 3 minutes that it took me to criticize myself every morning, I created a ritual where, as I oiled my skin, because I live in the desert, I would consciously pour love into my body and appreciate it for all the ways that it has served me and strengthened me. And eventually, what I found is that when I create rituals like that are simple and I hold myself accountable for doing them over and over again every single day, and eventually 6 to 8 weeks in, I start to notice a difference. and I've done that in ways that have increased my ability to value my intrinsic self-worth. And the practice of this with others is greatly helped, obviously, by having others to practice with. But honestly, creating environments where your team or your colleagues can actually share a personal story about what has helped formed their many identities, because each of us has many identities, right? I mean, gender, faith, class, background, where did you grow up, what did your parents believe in? All those things have shaped us. And that's a way of actually inviting your colleagues to bring some of their whole selves into work. And it doesn't have to be terribly time-consuming, but it's a way of creating a dignified, respectful space where people can actually say who they are and create a space where people's stereotypes or suppositions can be questioned or challenged in a caring way that's still respectful and dignified.
Thank you for sharing that, Nina. So I think just to check that I've understood two important processes there. So uncovering your own internal structures that are judgments of self, through that ritual of self-appreciation is one element of that. So if I'm connecting the dots correctly, any self-criticism is a self-violence, and it could be a systemic bias that exists. In any case, the cure is about reversing that in terms of self-appreciation, self-love anchored in ritual. And an embodied practice helps that bring it to life. So that's how I've understood the first aspect of what you shared. Is that, how am I going? Is that correct?
That's great. Yep.
Okay.
I think that's true.
In terms of looking then outward to the others that we share spaces with, where it's in family, friendship circles, or in workplaces that are other, as in not self, trying to open up our understanding of their experience through conversation, appreciative inquiry there, is a way to start unearthing potential biases that we might have. And to understand, to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes is an element of developing that empathy. Is that where we start to uncover some of the biases that we've got in our perspective?
Well, I think so, Zoe. And I also think that we all have biases. I mean, we have to start out saying we all have these things and create a space where there is a willingness both to take risks and to forgive errors. Because I think every woman in a business environment may have shared some experience of sitting in a meeting room that's predominantly men and coming up with a new idea or a suggestion and having it fall on deaf ears, and then having another man in the room say something almost precisely similar, and suddenly the men all glom onto it. But there's a way in which we as women also have internalized patriarchy and have a tendency to prejudge ourselves and therefore be not quite as bold or outspoken about voicing our concerns or our ideas. So, I mean, it's a complex tangle for sure, but I think that the healing and the outcome that we are aiming for is so valuable that the risk and the effort make it truly worthwhile.
Yeah, because the outcome, Nina, is a more compassionate society, which opens up the possibilities of contribution from multiple perspectives, multiple points of view, which, because we're all part of the system, is essential. We can't fix the system if we exclude elements of it. So definitely there's multiple reasons of why this important work is there. And it's hard heart work, right? It's hard to sit and listen to somebody else's experience of being sidelined or marginalized or ignored, and to feel a sense of responsibility in some ways for that because we are blind to it or ignorant to it up until that point. So it's a difficult thing to hold the space for all that emotion.
I think that that's true, although it becomes, like anything, it becomes easier with practice. And I do want to just push back on something that you said earlier, Zoe, which was that, I'm not a Pollyanna and I'm not about like negating all self-criticism. What I would say is we all thrive on growing ourselves in a feedback-rich environment. But there's a big difference between feedback that's intended to offer insight into both what your strengths are and where you could improve, and critique that's only about a deficit analysis. So I think that's another business thing that feels important.
That's a beautiful pushback, if you like. I think it's not even a pushback. It's an additional insight. And I think a feedback-rich environment, and you're right, it doesn't always have to be about a negative critique and a deficit approach. It's about understanding more of the whole. So I love this as a starting point, and it does take a whole of systems understanding to understand that pulling this thread or tweaking this thread in the web actually causes ripples across the whole system, because it can feel like it's a long way to go from having conversations and practicing self-love and self-appreciation to changing the entire ecosystem of business, politics, economics, and environmental concerns. Nina, this is such a powerful conversation, and what I want to ask you is, if I've understood this correctly, this whole idea of taking this aspect of self-awareness, of doing the work of understanding our own biases and doing the self-healing and self-appreciation, and then turning outwardly to understand the experiences and the value of the other humans around us, whether it's in our personal lives or our work lives, how that pulling that strand of the web has a ripple effect across all of our systems, if you like, economical, political, environmental. Is this the starting point of the work? And is that what you intend when we talk about transformation of the system?
Well, it's a great question, Zoe. And I think my theory of change really that underlies my work is that if we can all embrace a new vision and a new definition of leadership that says leadership is not for the few, but for the many, and that actually we are all called to be leaders at this moment in time in this life on earth. And what leadership really means to me is understanding your own gifts and talents and what you're most passionate about affecting in this moment of giant transformation that we're all already in, and then bringing yourself somehow towards that reinvention and committing in service to what you most care about and most love. Because I think part of our social inheritance has been a kind of complacency and a kind of we'll follow the leaders, if you will. And I think right now, if we are all called to be leaders and we can accept that the most fulfilling and joyful way to live your life is in service to what you care about most deeply, then it is both self-fulfilling, self-gratifying. It's a meaningful and joyful and loving way to live your life, and also has positive outcomes in terms of the world, in terms of the business or the venture that you may be leading. And I think that it's a win-win all around for each of us to really accept the mantle of self-responsibility in this moment when so much of what we care about is under threat.
That it was a beautiful insight and beautiful summary. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the whole on, the idea of the individual, which is a reflection of the whole. And that if we live fully into that self-appreciation and the call to advocacy for the things that we care about most, then the ripple effect, it's not even a ripple effect. We're changing the system from within the system, because each of us is a reflection of the system. That is probably one of the most inspirational ideas I've experienced in a long time. So, Nina, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Wow, Zoe, thank you so much for drawing it out of me in that way. I loved that. Thank you. It's really a delight. I love the way you make connections and build upon the people's work that you're featuring. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This has been a real privilege to have you on the show and to share your luminous, I'm not even sure if that's a word, but it sounds good, your luminous voice and insight. Your work is so important, and it's exactly what we need in the world right now. So thank you for everything that you do and for coming on the show in particular. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Zoe. It's my joy and honor.
Well, it's not every day that I get to talk with such a luminary. What a powerful conversation. And the insights were pretty significant. Probably the two that are sticking out for me the most is Nina's assertion that feedback is a positive feedback loop. That was a bit redundant. Feedback is a positive loop. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a deficit approach. And the idea of being in conversation with others to unearth positive and negative experiences as a critical way of understanding other and difference is pretty important. So feedback, it's good. That was one of the key takeaways, just to bring it down to brass tacks there. And the second one was the whole idea of the individual work that we do of self-appreciation, self-love, and self-understanding is a whole-on activity, meaning that what we do for self is reflected and experienced by the whole. It's kind of an esoteric idea, and yet if we understand the interrelated nature of everything, as Nina began our conversation with today, then we know that the work that we do on ourselves, for ourselves, has an immediate effect on everything around us. So if we're looking for how do we affect change on a bigger, grander scale, that always starts with self. And this is encouraging for all of us to take agency in our lives, to look after ourselves, to love the people around us, and to pick up the cause or causes for which we feel deeply, because all of that is having an effect on the interrelated systems in which we find ourselves. Okay, big ideas for today. And if you're excited by these stimulating big ideas, why not join our community? Our community is called Amplifiers, and we've recently zhuzhed it up, done a big restructure, and made it more accessible for people coming in. So you can come in and do a 90-day intensive on one of our core fundamental topics: lead culture, lead change, lead performance, and lead strategy. And they kick off every 90 days as the project intends. And as this is recording, we are about to do a promotion for the next quarter somewhere in October. So come onto our website, zoerouth.com, click on events, and you'll find some information there about our next kickoff session for our next 90-day program as part of Amplifiers. Love to have you on board. Love to share your big ideas, because you matter, you make a difference. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation today. I certainly did. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.